That year's autumn was especially harsh and windy in the quiet town of Ash Hollow. Margaret Thompson, a widow for almost 10 years, lived alone in her old Victorian house on the edge of town. Her days were quiet, morning tea, knitting, the radio humming old tunes. Everything changed one evening when the postman delivered a letter with no return address. On the yellowed paper, there was only one line, handwritten in faded ink. "Do you still believe he died a natural death?" Margaret dropped the letter. Her heart pounded like it hadn't since the day of her husband's funeral. Richard Thompson. Long after the fire had gone cold and the shadows lengthened across the hardwood floors, Margaret stood in the narrow hallway on the second floor, gazing out the side window. The glass was slightly warped with age, like an old lens distorting the truth. From this very window, 10 years ago, she had seen Richard walking arm in arm with their neighbor, Eleanor Blake. It was late in the evening, and Richard had told her he was going to the store for cough syrup. Instead, he had stopped at Eleanor's, stayed for over an hour, and left only when night had fallen completely. Margaret had seen them laughing. Eleanor's hand had lingered on his shoulder. And Richard, he hadn't even looked guilty. But Margaret hadn't confronted him. She had told herself it was harmless. She had closed the window, locked it, and tucked the memory away. Now, 10 years later, the cold night air seeped in through the edges of the old frame, and she felt that same ache she'd ignored for too long. Betrayal, confusion, and fear. That night, the house seemed more alive than ever before. Margaret heard creaks in the floor that didn't match her movements. The kitchen light flickered on its own. In the hallway, the portrait of Richard that had hung in the same place for years crashed to the floor without reason. She stared at it, his smiling face frozen in time. The glass had shattered in a perfect spiderweb around his eyes. As she picked it up, she whispered, "Why now? Why, after all these years?" She didn't expect an answer. But later that night, in her dreams, she found herself in the old tool shed. The wooden walls were wet, the air thick and musty, and she wasn't alone. From the shadows, she heard Richard's voice. "You never asked what really happened." Then another voice, quieter, colder. "She lied, and you believed her. Now I'm still here, still waiting." Margaret woke with a start. The sheets tangled around her legs like vines. The next morning was overcast, the sky a slate gray. Margaret wrapped a scarf around her neck and walked across the yard toward Eleanor's home. They hadn't spoken in years, not since Richard's funeral. Eleanor looked older, thinner, as if life had slowly drained out of her. She opened the door without a word, her eyes hollow and distant. "You sent the letter," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor hesitated, then stepped aside. Inside, the house smelled of lavender and mothballs. Old newspapers were stacked in corners. A photograph of Richard, tucked inside a worn Bible, sat on the mantel. "I had to tell someone," Eleanor said, voice trembling. "I couldn't keep it in anymore." She sat down, her hands wringing the edge of her sweater. "He came to me that night, said he was leaving you. We argued. I was angry, pushed him, maybe harder than I meant to. He lost his footing, fell down the stairs to the basement. I panicked, told the police I found him like that. No one asked questions. Margaret felt the room spin. Everything. The grief, the doubt, the years of unanswered questions hit her all at once. "I loved him too," Eleanor whispered, "but I wasn't strong enough to carry the guilt." Margaret walked home in a daze. Her feet knew the way, but her heart no longer felt anchored in her chest. Her life had been built on a false ending. Not a quiet death, but a violent lie. All these years, she had lived alongside Richard's ghost without knowing it. That night, the house grew colder than it had in years. The fire refused to catch. The walls creaked as if sighing. Shadows moved where they shouldn't. She lay in bed, listening. Then she heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming up the stairs. Margaret didn't move. Then, the voice. Not angry, but calm, familiar. "You know now. That's all I needed. Now, we're together again." She turned toward the sound, but the room was empty. Only Richard's old scarf was folded neatly on the edge of the bed, though it had been lost the night he died. The next morning, neighbors noticed the front door hanging open. Inside, the house was still, untouched. No sign of struggle. No sign of Margaret. Only the portrait of Richard had been restored to the wall. Glass intact. Dusted clean. And next to him, as if it had always been there, was Margaret's photo, smiling faintly in black and white.